Hello guys, welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to sew an off-shoulder jumpsuit. For this tutorial, I used 2.5 yards of a lightweight crepe fabric. However, you can use any fabric of your choice. Also, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do well to hit the subscribe button. And if you end up enjoying this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up. With that being said, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to be doing is to draft out the down part of this jumpsuit, which is the trouser part. So to do that, we are going to be marking out our waistline, our hip line, our crotch line, our thigh line, and the length of the trouser. To get the crotch line, just sit on a flat surface or on a chair and measure from your waistline down to where your butt hits the chair. And whatever you get, add 0.5 into it because this is a jumpsuit and we want it to be as free as possible. And then to get the length of the trouser, subtract your half length from your overall dress measurement. If you notice, this paper is not up to what I need for my trouser length, but I'll be extending it on the fabric when I'm cutting. So the next thing I'm going to do is to mark quarter of my hip measurements on the hip line, on the crotch line, and on the waistline. After marking, I'll connect it. When I'm done with that, I'm going to be dividing my thigh measurement by 2 and I'm going to be marking it on the crotch line. And then from here, I'll go in by 0.5 inches and then I'll connect it all the way down to the crotch line. Then after doing this, from the waistline, I'm going to be marking quarter of my waist measurement plus 0.5 inch sewing allowance. This 0.5 inch sewing allowance will be what I'll be using to join the center front. I'm still going to add another allowance at the side seam while cutting. So when you're done with that, you just connect it down to the hip line. After doing that, on the crotch line, I'm going to be dividing this by 2. That is the 12 divided by 2, that is 6 inches. So I'm going to be marking 6 inches on the thigh line, on the crotch line, and on the length of the trouser. And then on the thigh line, I'm going to be dividing my thigh measurement by 2. Since this is a free jumpsuit, I added 3 inches to my thigh measurement, so which is 20 inches in all. So I'm dividing 20 by 2, that is 10 inches. So this 10 inches, I'm going to be dividing it equally, 5 inch on both sides, and I'll connect it all the way to the hip line. Then after doing this, I'm also going to connect it down to the trouser length, marking the same measurement. I'm going to be slimming this down later on. And then from the waistline, I'm going to be marking half of my nipple to nipple measurement plus 0.5 inch sewing allowance. So my nipple to nipple measurement is 3.5 plus 0.5, that is 4 inches. So I'm marking 4 inches. And then I'm also going down by 4 inches, which is the length of the dart. And then also I'll be marking 0.5 inches on both sides and I'll connect it down to the 4 inches length. And then from here, I'll just cut it out. After doing this, on the trouser length, I'm just going to be slimming this. It just depends on what you prefer. I'm going in by 0.5 inch. You can go in by 1 inch, or you can even leave it as it is. So after doing this, you're going to cut it out. The next thing I'm going to be doing is to be drafting the back pattern. So for the back pattern, I'm using a pattern paper that is larger than the front, and I marked out all my measurements. That is my waistline, my hip line, my crotch line, my thigh line, and the length of the trouser. So now I'm going to be placing the front pattern on the back pattern like I'm doing now, and I will tape it down. After taping it down, the next thing to do now is to divide quarter of my hip measurements by 2. So take note where I place the tape rule. I place the tape rule from the straight line all the way to the hip. And then I divided my quarter of my hip measurements by 2. So from these new points that I marked, I'm going to be marking quarter of my hip measurements on it. So from that point all the way to the other side. So these new points that I marked now will become the crotch depth of the back pattern. While on the tie line, I'm going to be adding 2 inches to it. I'm also going to add 2 inches to the trouser length. The reason why I'm doing this is because the back side is bigger than the front. Also on the waistline, I'm going to be extending it by 1.5 inches for the back pattern. I'll be using this for the zipper allowance as well. And you can use 2 inches or more. It just depends on how big your butt is. When you're done with this, the next thing to do now is from these new points that we marked, we are going to be measuring quarter of our waist measurements plus the darts plus 0.5 inch sewing allowance. When we mark this point, we are going to connect it all the way to the hip line. When you're done with this, you're going to cut it out and you will have the back pattern. Then for the front pattern, the last thing to do is to go down by 0.5 inch and you connect it all the way to the side and cut it out. And this will be all for the front pattern. So you just label it and you keep it aside. While for the back pattern, all we have to do is to draw out the darts. So for the dart, we are going to be marking half of our nipple to nipple measurements plus 1 inch sewing allowance. That is for the zipper at the side. So that means we will be having 4.5 inches. And then we'll go down by 5 inches, unlike for the front that we went down by 4 inches. For the back, we are going down by 5 inches. And we are connecting it to 0.5 inch on both sides. And that will be all for the back pattern. So the next thing to do now is to draft out the top part of this jumpsuit. For that, we are going to be marking out our chest line, our bust line, and our waistline. And then after that, we are going to be marking half of our shoulder measurements on the chest line and on the top line. And then also, we are going to be marking where we want the off shoulder to start from. I'm using 5 inches. On the bust line, we're going to be marking half of our nipple to nipple measurement, and we are going to connect it all the way to the waistline. And then from the bust line, we'll go down by 1 inch, while on the waistline, we are going to mark 0.5 inch on both sides and you connect it. Then on the chest line, we are going to be marking quarter of our bust measurements, while on the waistline, we are going to be marking quarter of our waist measurements plus 1 inch for the darts. And you connect it. When you're done with this, you're going to remember to add your sewing allowance. I'm using 1 inch on both sides and I'll connect. Then on this off shoulder line, I'm going to be marking half of my off shoulder measurement, which is from one bra strap to the next, and on the chest line I'll go down by 0.5 inch, and then I'll connect it all the way to my off shoulder measurement. Then from here I'll just extend the chest line. Remember, this pattern is on fold, so I'm going to connect the chest line and I'll cut it off. So for the front pattern, I'm going to be cutting out the zipper allowance. I also will not be needing that in front. While for the back pattern, I'm going to be drawing out the zipper allowance. And I'm also going to be drawing out the chest line. So from the chest line, I mark my half of my nipple to nipple measurements and connect it to the waistline. And then I go down by 1 inch, and on the waistline, I mark 0.5 each and I connect, drawing the darts. And that will be all for the top of this jumpsuit. When you're done with this, the next thing to do now is to place your fabric on a fold and you cut the front and the back pattern of the trouser. So take note that I did not add any sewing allowance to the center front because I added it while drafting the pattern. And I've also gone ahead to extend the length of the trouser because the pattern is too short for me. And then I added 1 inch sewing allowance to the side and ½ inch on the waistline. Then to draw out the pockets, the first thing to do is to mark 2 inches away from the side seam, and then you go down by 6 inches and you connect it, drawing a straight line. After drawing this out, you're going to cut it off. And then from here, we are going to be taking the darts for both the front and the back. After taking the darts, I have gone ahead to cut out 2 pieces for the pockets. The width of this is 14 inches. So I'm going to be by the time I fold it, it's going to be 7. While the length of it is about 8 to 10 inches. Just depends on what you prefer. So now the next thing to do now is to fold the pocket to the wrong side as I did. And you're going to be placing it on the trouser like so, making sure that the waistline is aligned alongside the hip line. So when you're done with this, from this point, you're going to measure your quarter of your waist measurements plus 1 inch sewing allowance, and you connect it all the way to the hip line. When you're done with this, you're going to cut it off. So after cutting it off, we are going to be removing 1 piece of the pockets. That is 1 part. You know it's on fold, so we are going to be cutting just 1 side of it to be the same with the trouser, while the other part we are going to be leaving it as it is. Then from here, we're going to be removing it, and this is what it should look like. So the part that is deeper, we're going to be aligning it to the trouser, to the front part of the trouser, and we're going to be sewing using ½ an inch sewing allowance. So when you're done sewing, you're going to notch it and then turn it to the right side and top stitch. After top stitching, we are going to be folding it back as it was before, making sure that the waistline is aligned to the pocket and the hip line is also aligned to the pocket. So when you're done, you're going to sew it on the waistline and the hip line, connecting the pockets to the trouser. And that will be all for this pocket. After joining the pockets to the trouser, all you have to do now is to sew the end of the pockets, and that will be all for the pocket. So now we are going to do the same thing for the other side of the trouser. And now you join both sides together like so, and you sew using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. Then for the back pattern, I've also gone ahead to join both sides together after taking the dart, and I also using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. But for the back, I'm going to be starting from the hip line all the way down to the crotch depth. Then when you're done with this is what it should look like. So the opening there will be where we'll be attaching the zip. Then from this point, we're going to be joining the front to the back using 1 inch sewing allowance. So when you're done with this is what it should look like. So the next thing to do now is to just join the crotch depth of the front to the crotch depth of the back. And then you join it all the way to the trouser length. At this point, I've also gone ahead to cut out the top part of the jumpsuit. So now you're just going to be notching where the dart is on the front and on the back. For the front, I cut it on fold, while for the back, I cut separately because we'll be adding zip to it. So by the time you open the front, this is what it should look like. So now all we have to do is to take the darts for both the front and the back. After taking the dart, this is what it looks like. Then from this point, I'm using a bias to close the armhole of this top. After closing the armhole, I've done the same thing for the back as well. So now I'm going to be joining the front pattern to the back pattern at the side seam using 1 inch sewing allowance. The next thing to do now is to cut the full circle that is on the jumpsuit. The length of the fabric that I'm using on fold is 13 inches, while the width of it is 26 inches. So I'm going to be folding it further into 4 pieces. So now I'm going to be dividing my my round shoulder measurements by 6, and I'm going to be marking it on the fabric like so. Then from here, I'm also going to be marking the length of the full circle. I'm using 6 inches plus 1 inch sewing allowance, that is 7 inches. So in all, I'm marking 13 inches thereabout. So after marking it out, you're going to cut. Please take note, remember to notch the ends of this full circle so that you know how to place it on the top. So when you're done, you're going to open one side. The part you're opening will be for the zipper. Then from here, we're going to be aligning the full circle to the top at the middle. Take note that I'm facing the wrong side of the top to the right side of the full circle, and then I'm pinning it all the way to where the top ends. And then when I'm done with that, I'm going to be taking the full circle at the zipper point, and I'm joining it to the top at the zipper point, facing the wrong side of the top to the right side of the peplum, as I did earlier. I'm also going to do the same thing for the other side as well, facing the wrong side of the top to the right side of the full circle. So after pinning it, when you open it, this is what it should look like. And then now I'm going to be sewing using 1/2 inch sewing allowance. Then when I'm done, I'm going to top stitch it to the right side, and this is what it should look like. So from this point now, I'm going to be joining the top to the trouser to form the jumpsuit. I'm aligning the middle of the front of the trouser to the middle of the front of the top. So by the time you pin it down and you join both sides using 1/2 inch sewing allowance, this is what it should look like. So all we have to do now is to attach an invincible zipper to this, and that will be all for today's video. Please, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.